On Ball State today, a retired admiral discusses world peace and arms control. A British lord, who is also a World Bank advisor, talks about third world debt. And a Ball State University professor explains his research on the Maitland artwork in Muncie Grace Episcopal Church. Admiral Noel Gayler, US Navy retired, at Ball State University as a visiting professor, discussed with us his views on an East-West settlement and world peace. Admiral Gayler, following the recent summit between President Reagan and Premier Gorbachev, do you feel we've moved any closer to an East-West accord?
I think a little bit, because at least the exchanges were civil and they made a personal contact, which should make it easier to negotiate in the future. But unless there was some secret agreement, there doesn't seem to have been any substantive progress at all.
What are your views on an East-West accord?
I think it is necessary that we understand the Soviet Union better than we do, and that they understand us better than they do. That doesn't mean that we should support or be pro-Soviet, but we should understand them. And I think it's extremely important in a situation where we both have about 25,000 nuclear weapons, where we're both in the habit nowadays of saying insulting and slanderous things about each other and planning as if for war. And that is a very dangerous situation. I think we ought to turn it around.
Don't you feel there's a great deal of mistrust on the part of the American people and on the part of the Russians towards each other? And does it not have some foundation?
There's certainly some foundation for mistrust, but I think it's greatly exaggerated on the part of both of us. In the streets of Moscow, you see storefronts with a dummy of an American soldier sticking a bayonet into a woman lying on the ground, that sort of thing. They're actually much worse than we are. But perhaps the most important thing of all is to restore a certain civility in our relationships.
You're on the board of several peace groups. Is that an accurate description?
I wouldn't call them peace groups. I want to make it clear myself, I am a strong believer in the military strength of the United States, not only for our own security, but because we're the only country that's both strong and free. The strong countries are the free countries. We're the only one that's both. We have a special responsibility for freedom in the world. But these nuclear weapons are no contribution to our strength, to our military capability, anything else. They're just danger. They have no sensible military use.
There are some, but we don't find many military men of your rank lecturing around the country for abolition of nuclear weapons and nuclear war. How do you react to that?
Well, I think that there are more professional military people who understand what real military strength is and isn't than is generally realized. And in my perception, the nuclear hawks are not uniformed people, but are certain civilians in the Defense Department and outside. Generally speaking, people who know nothing about war.
How would you reach an East-West accord?
I think you should start with the most pressing and dangerous thing, that is to reduce the risk of nuclear war. And I think we could propose and agree with the Soviets on very specific things, like reducing the level of intemperate and insulting languages we use toward each other, the war psychosis, like doing away with the military doctrines for the first use of nuclear weapons, or the so-called counterforce use of nuclear weapons, pulling our tactical weapons on both sides out of range of each other, making deep and continuing cuts in the numbers of nuclear weapons by a process of turning them in under Soviet and American supervision, and converting the nuclear material into power plant material, a number of other measures like that, specific, concrete measures that we can negotiate.
All right,
make us both safer.
To ensure that this was done without cheating, it's going to take supervision and inspection. How can each side trust each other? Isn't it true that both sides are opposed to inspection without certain safeguards?
Well, we have, as you know, proposed access to the Soviets in the hopes that they will grant us access, which they have not done. But it isn't really necessary. From my standpoint of experience in the intelligence business and in the nuclear targeting business, it turns out that any number of weapons, any amount of cheating sufficient to make a difference would have to be enormous. And we have very good intelligence of our own kind. Photo satellites that can take better pictures than you can across the room very nearly. New radar satellites that can do almost the same thing in bad weather. We're able to detect underground blasts hundreds of miles away, distinguish them from earthquakes, many other technical means like that. And the Soviets, of course, have some of them, and they also have much better access to our open society than they have to theirs.
You mentioned, for example, reducing tension, for example, with tactical weapons facing each other.
Yes.
In Europe is a good example.
For example.
All right. Do you propose that we pull back our tactical weapons and then have the Russians pull back theirs, or should it be done simultaneously, or what would be the process?
Well, I think they should pull back out of range of each other, and certainly simultaneously would be better. I don't see any point in doing it unilaterally. But the reliance on tactical nuclear weapons in Europe is a mistake because it's an empty bluff. No president with all his marbles would ever start a nuclear war in Europe with the almost certain danger of escalation and the destruction of the United States.
Wouldn't that be a good negotiating point, withdrawing our troops and tactical weapons from Europe?
I didn't say troops. I said tactical nuclear weapons. It's a very different thing. The Russian tank armies are on the borders of Europe. There's no evidence that they intend an attack. I don't think they do. It would be an extremely dangerous thing from their standpoint. But they're there, and we're not talking about withdrawing troops or Air Force. We're talking about getting nuclear weapons, which are not usable, only danger, out of range of each other.
The main point that you're making is that you're not talking about military reduction, you're talking about nuclear reduction.
Exactly, exactly.
How about the dangers of a third world power such as Muammar Gaddafi getting a hold of the bomb and running amok?
I think they're extremely, that there's an extreme danger. I'm not so much worried about a graduate student making one in his basement as I am about somebody with a commando laying hands on one of the 7,000 weapons that are lying around Europe in our hands and the corresponding number in Russian hands. And that's an awful lot. We safeguard them. I hope they do too. But banks get robbed, and that's too many to have around.
Do you see any promise with the leadership of Gorbachev in Russia as far as easing East-West tensions, or am I putting too much emphasis and blame on the Russians, and is this typical?
Well, it's of course our point of view that the Russians are mostly at fault, but realistically they've made about as many propositions toward reducing nuclear weapons and nuclear tensions as we have. I think if we both would start taking up some of the propositions the other side advances, like Gorbachev's proposition for a moratorium on testing and development, instead of projecting them out of hand as propaganda, we'd do much better.
You know, the man on the street has no way of knowing. We have to rely on our leaders. President Reagan has said that the Russians have made so many treaty violations, in fact, have violated every treaty or agreement we've made with them. Is this true?
No, it's not factual. And it's not factual that the man on the street has no way of understanding what the situation is. In fact, there's some aspects of it that are very simple. The way to get rid of nuclear weapons is to get rid of nuclear weapons. The way to reduce the danger of nuclear war is to reduce the perceived danger of the Soviets to us and the perceived danger that we have to the Soviets, to reduce some of this paranoia, semi-paranoia that we have about each other. These are things that the man in the street can understand. These are political things. These are things that in our free country, the man in the street has a responsibility to understand. He can't turn his gaze away and say, this is too terrible for me to think about. I'll think about it tomorrow. He can't say, well, those folks in Washington, they know all the angles. Poor little me. He can't do that either. The basic idea that the way to prevent a nuclear war is not to have it happen, and that to have a nuclear war is intolerable, that's something that the man in the street can understand.
Do you foresee the complete elimination of nuclear weapons at any point in the future?
I think that's a little optimistic, but I do see that a process of deep and continuing cuts in nuclear weapons can run until both sides, we and the Soviets, are down to a minimum invulnerable deterrent against nuclear war, not against anything else. And that will be a much safer place to be than we are now. And in addition, it'll give both of us far more standing with the other nuclear powers, China, France, and Britain, and with the other ambitious nuclear powers like Pakistan and possibly South Africa, to put the heat on them. We and the Soviets should be able to cooperate to do that. As a matter of fact, we have on one occasion in the case of South Africa.
The Right Honorable Lord Grenfell, an advisor to the World Bank, lecturing at Ball State, mentions the important work of the World Bank, but cautions about the mounting debt of third world countries and the inability of some of those countries to even repay the interest on their loans. Lord Grenfell, you've been with the World Bank for some 21 years. Perhaps before we get into talking about some of the economic problems facing the world and how the World Bank works to resolve some of those problems, you might tell our audience how the World Bank functions.
Yes, delighted to do so. The World Bank is an international bank. It's an agency of the United Nations. It's a cooperative bank in the sense that the nations own it. The United States is the largest shareholder, and we have 150 member states of the World Bank. And our function is to lend money to the developing countries for specific economic development projects which will help raise living standards, alleviate poverty, and bring their economies up to industrialization. This is not taxpayers' money that we're using for the most part. By far the largest sum of money that goes to the developing countries through our bank we raise on the capital markets ourselves. So we're not tapping the taxpayers for this money, except for a certain amount of money every year which we lend to the very poorest countries, which comes from the taxpayers of about 33 nations. But 75% of everything that we lend we raise ourselves.
We've heard a great deal of news about some of the major third world countries faltering on their loan, delaying interest payments, and in some cases threatening to refuse repayment. What is the present situation in respect to the defaulting of loans?
Well, the situation at the moment is that it's being contained. There are some countries which are making a lot of noise, like Peru. Their new president has said that he is only going to repay loans, or foreign loans, up to the equivalent of 10% of Peru's export earnings, and says he can't afford more. That's something that will have to be negotiated. It's a position that most of the others don't want to take, because they feel this will destroy their already weak creditworthiness and simply cut off all further funds. But the situation is still quite serious. Particularly in Latin America, the Latin American countries owe about $360 billion, of which some $220 billion is to private banks, about 140 billion of that to American banks. So the situation is still serious. We are working on ways to try and relieve the situation, but the only way they're ever going to repay this debt is by getting their economies growing again. That's what we're trying to help them do. How
about Peru? What attitude has the bank taken since their statement?
Well, we're disappointed in what they've said. We understand their problem, but we don't think this is the way to solve it. The way in which these heavily indebted countries are going to recover their creditworthiness is by getting their economies going again. And to get their economies going again, they need a continuing inflow of funds from both international organizations and from commercial banks. And if you turn around and say you're not going to repay, well then of course no commercial bank is going to continue to lend you money, and they will have grave difficulty with international organizations and international financial institutions as well. So really, if you're going to pull yourself out of the problem, you've got to play the game and keep going, and keep up at least paying your interest payments, and then something can be done. We can help them. So we hope that Peru will see it that way, but as indeed all the other Latin American countries do.
Communist countries are always happy to see problems, severe problems faced democracies, and do what they can to stir problems and stir trouble. And Fidel Castro, dictator of Cuba, advocated to these Latin American countries that they default on their loans as a way of injuring our economy. Has this had any effect?
Well, not very much, because Fidel Castro, as you say, has encouraged them to default. But he hasn't had a good reception from the other Latin American countries, by and large, because they are members of the international financial system. These countries are members of the International Monetary Fund and of the World Bank. Cuba is not. Castro took Cuba out of these institutions. So he's crying from the sidelines, and he's sending wrong messages, which are recognized as wrong by these countries. He's on the outside. Of course, there are some communist countries who are on the inside of the system, like Hungary, Romania, who are People's Republic of China, who are members in good standing of the World Bank and the IMF. And so you don't hear them going around advocating that sort of retaliation. It's from the countries that are outside the system, and their message is not getting across because people inside the system know that it would be ruinous to their position and wouldn't be helpful.
Argentina seems to have taken great steps to reduce their inflation and resolve their economic problems.
Yes, they have indeed. It's a remarkable performance that they've done, and we have to support them, because maintaining democracy in Argentina is on the international agenda. We have to help them maintain civilian government and get their economy growing again. They've made enormous strides. They've cut inflation down to very, very little indeed. And the international institutions are doing all they can. The president of the World Bank, my boss, has just been down there to see them, and we're hopeful that we can get things going there.
They would be a fine example for other Latin American countries.
It certainly would. I mean, they've tightened the belt very tightly down there. They mustn't tighten too far, or they will have the sort of social unrest that could destabilize them again. That's why it's so important for international organizations and bilateral countries that can help to do something seriously with these countries, because it does in the end mean the maintenance of democracy.
Mexico probably has as severe an economic problem as any of the Latin American countries, and the United States recently said that it would help resolve Mexico's economic problems. And an economist compared that with dropping a pebble in the ocean to raise the tides.
Well, Mexico's had a particularly unfortunate time. Of course, they rode high for a while when the oil prices were high, and they spent a lot of money. They are now in a difficult situation. They got caught in the world recession, just like many other countries. They found their debts weighing very heavily on them. They weren't able to export nearly as much as they had been exporting, particularly to the United States. And then, of course, the earthquake hit. That's cost them about $4 billion. They're in poor shape, but it's a resilient country with good natural resources and a very energetic people. And with the right sort of help and encouragement, and with a government that can put in place the sort of policies that are going to get growth going again, our southern neighbor is going to be in good shape again eventually, but it'll take some time.
Does the World Bank have a current loan to Libya? And does it support the Gaddafi regime?
No, we have lent in that. We did lend in the past to Libya, but recently no, because they became an oil-rich country, and they have not been looking for international loans, so we don't.
Do you look at the stability of the government when you loan the money?
We look at everything, but we do make our loans strictly on economic criteria. If instability is a problem, it's a problem to us not for a political reason, but because it's very difficult to implement a good project like building new roads or working in the agricultural sector if the country is in turmoil. You just can't deliver the goods, you can't supervise the execution of the project, you can't get the thing going. So there, obviously, you don't lend money for a project and try and execute in the middle of a civil war or something like that. But we don't mind about what the color of the politics of the regime is. We lend to capitalist countries, we lend to socialist countries. We lend about $1.5 billion to $2 billion a year to the People's Republic of China, and they use the money extraordinarily well. So we don't mind what their politics are, but we do want to know that there's stability in the country so that the job can be done with the money that they're borrowing.
Is it fair to say, in essence, you're trying to increase the quality of life?
I would think that's probably the best possible way you could sum it up. The whole objective of the World Bank's work, of the whole of the international aid effort, is to improve the quality of life for the hundreds of millions of people who are still living in unacceptable poverty. That is the bottom line. You've got to help raise these people up.
As an international banker, and this perhaps has no relation, obviously, from the reply on Gaddafi in Libya to the World Bank, but as an international banker, what are your views on the effectiveness of the Reagan economic sanctions against that country?
Well, I must be careful what I say, because of the United States government is a part employer of mine, since they're a senior shareholder of my institution. Let me put it another way. I'm something of a student of history. I have never yet come across a situation in which sanctions have really worked very well. They didn't work against Italy when they were imposed by the League of Nations before the last war, when Mussolini walked into Libya, curiously enough, into Ethiopia, sorry, and he was already in Libya. It didn't work really against Rhodesia either. So on a general level, I'm somewhat skeptical of the effects of sanctions. Sometimes they can work, but most of the time I don't think they do.
Giving us an objective opinion as to the effectiveness of the World Bank over its, 40-year history?
Yes. What do I think of it? I think it's done a remarkable job. It's helped an enormous number of countries. Strange to say, we've only ever had one default on our lending, and we've lent billions and billions of dollars, and we've seen the results in countries that are now industrializing, that are now feeding themselves, that now have higher literacy rates, that now have better health services, that now have better transportation systems, better communications. The banks contributed a lot to all of them.
Who was at default?
I'd rather not say. That's it would be unfair to single out a single country.
Not a matter of record?
It's not a matter of record, no. But there has only been one over 40 years, which is rather remarkable.
The Muncie Grace Episcopal Church has one of the few rood screens in the country. Dr. Jack Reak, professor of secondary education at Ball State University, a member of the parish, has completed 2 years of research on the wrought iron work in the church, designed and made and contributed by Edward Maitland of Muncie, a nationally recognized iron designer and craftsman. Dr. Reak, what is the significance of the rood screen?
Well, the rood screen, the word rood itself means cross, simply cross. And coming out of the English tradition, brought to England by the Normans, was the idea of hanging inside of a church a great cross, huge. Then as the years went by, it began to be supported by works of art, either in wood or iron, and sometimes in stone. And it was to be the central focus of the church.
Is the rood screen we see behind you the only one of its kind in Muncie?
Yes.
And it was, of course, done by Mr. Maitland.
Mr. Maitland, yes.
And it took how long to complete?
It took him 3 years from the time he began the research until this rood screen here was installed. He was concerned about designing a screen that would be compatible with this very small church. Most of those which came out of the English tradition were very heavy and Gothic. He decided that the Spanish ironwork would lend itself better to this. Therefore, he designed one with the Spanish motif to fit into this building.
Dr. Reak, as we view the rood screen, there appears to be a great deal of significance in each section.
Well, symbolism characterizes the screen. For instance, the center focus, of course, is the crucifixion. It is resting upon a symbol of the earth. On the one side is Mary, the mother of Jesus. On the other side is St. John Divine. Mary has above her a dove of peace. Above St. John Divine would be a triangle representing the Holy Trinity. Underneath you see the symbols of Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. There's a double meaning, Mr. Maitland said, to the Omega there, in that St. John Divine was the last of the apostles to live. All of the symbolism he attempted to incorporate into the screen as much symbolism relating to the gospel story that he would be able to do.
For example, we see roses related to Mary, and we see lilies and
yes,
other
those
flowers.
Are early symbols of the church. And around the cross you find a grapevine, which would be symbolic of ye are the vine, I am the branches. Also a double symbolism here in terms of the wine for the Holy Communion.
Was this a contribution to the church on the part of Mr. Maitland?
Yes, it was a gift to the church. It incidentally rests upon a foundation of its own underneath the basement, because it weighs over a ton, and it couldn't, the floor of the church obviously wouldn't support that. So under each one of the pillars here, there is a separate foundation to support the screen.
Edward Maitland's other contributions included the pulpit to your immediate left and also the chandeliers.
Yes. He designed the chandeliers, or light fittings, in 1938. They were a gift of Mr. and Mrs. Bracken. The pulpit came in 1940. It was a gift of the Lincoln family. And like the rood screen, they are full of symbolism. The light fixtures identifying the four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The pulpit is called the pulpit of the Beatitudes. If you can get way down, you find, for instance, the base of the pulpit is filled with Hebrew symbolism, and the top part of the pulpit is filled with the symbolism coming from the Beatitudes. Each of the groups or individuals who would have been blessed by one of the Beatitudes is portrayed on here.
That is metalwork over oak.
Oak, yes. Poplar, I'm sorry.
Over poplar wood.
Yes.
Mr. Maitland started the projects in 1927 and the completion with the pulpit in 1940?
Yes.
He was a very accomplished artisan.
Yes, he did other work here in Muncie. He did some work in St. Mary's Church. He did work in one of the ball homes around the pipe organ, and then he did a great number of fireplace screens.
And he also did work for other notables around the country.
Yes, one of the screens that he did, a fireplace screen, was for the pineapple Dole family. We have pictures of those that I was able to gather while I was putting the booklet together, and all the raw data from this is now at the Special Collections section of Bracken Library, so in case someone should want to do research on any of this artwork in the future, the primary documents and the original photographs would be there.
This booklet, recently published by Dr. Jack Reak, who is retiring in March after 27 years at Ball State University, is available at the Grace Episcopal Church, and it details the work of Mr. Maitland and the many pieces that are in the church.